Hello, everybody, I'll start again. Hello, everybody, as we look back at the election of last November. The one thing that I can't forget, that still rankles, stuck in my throat, is Kamala Harris's decision not to be interviewed by Joe Rogan because of her fears about a progressive backlash, particularly of her staff. And it brings to mind a very different age. Back in 1977, Jesse Jackson, at that point perhaps the leading voice within the African-American community, and David Duke, a grand wizard, a man who was in the business back in 1977 of trying to legitimize or mainstream the Klan, sat down for an interview on Jesse Jackson's show. This is an interesting episode in American history, and one that's covered by my guest today, David Masciotra, in an interesting article about it. David, how did you find out about this 1977 debate?
Well, thanks for having me on, Andrew. I have written a book on Jesse Jackson. I Am Somebody, Why Jesse Jackson Matters. And to write that book, I spent 6 years conducting regular interviews with Reverend Jackson, traveling with him and observing his work from a front row seat. And one day when we were talking, he just made casual passing reference to it, you know, in the 70s when I debated David Duke. And I stopped him and said, wait a minute, you debated David Duke? And we discussed it. And he said that debate is part of the bedrock of democracy. And he delineated this philosophy of moral jujitsu, that if one is sufficiently skillful as a debater, as a rhetorician, as a political advocate, as certainly Jackson was and is, then one can use the force of someone who is reactionary, regressive, and in Duke's case, revolting, and his views were outright evil, use their own force against them and expose them as foolish and contemptible. So the debate is available in its entirety online. One can find it. It's linked in my piece. And my mind immediately went there when I read that young progressive members of the Kamala Harris campaign staff convinced her, this is according to Jennifer Palmieri, who was an aide for Bill Clinton and worked for the Harris campaign, to back out of a sit-down discussion with Joe Rogan because they said that it would create, as you suggested, a backlash. Rogan, according to their view, is a chauvinist. He's a transphobe. He's a peddler of noxious conspiracy theories. I happen to agree with all of that, but I think that the decision not to sit with him was not only costly and harmful to the campaign, but especially in juxtaposition to Jackson's courage and confidence and brilliance, exposes a weakness in the contemporary progressive mindset.
David, could we reverse this? Might there be people on the right who might credit Duke with sitting down with Jackson, or is this a one-way street? And when they're looking back, I know that last year we had John Gantz on the show. His book has done very well, When the Clock Broke, Con Men, Conspiracists, and How America Cracked Up in the Early 1990s. It's a book about the reinvention of the right and the mainstreaming, actually, of David Duke in the 1990s. But could this argument be put on its head? Might you have a Steve Bannon or a Stephen Miller who might say, well, we should credit Duke with going on to the Jackson show and being open to discussing ideas?
Well, certainly. And I know that Duke, even though Duke seems, if you watch the debate, it's evident by the end that Duke is aware that Jackson demolished him, because Duke makes of course, a racist comment, but he says Jesse Jackson's intelligence isn't representative of the black race, and he says it rather nervously.
Which is an astonishing remark. I mean, a kind of eugenicist remark
Well,
that
of course,
black people's IQs are lower than white people's.
right. And of course, this is what Duke believed, and Charles Murray mainstreamed in the 80s.
Yeah, but would you collapse Murray and Duke?
Well, they have some similarities, but to answer your question, Duke did, even though he appeared to acknowledge he lost the debate, he did see it as a propaganda victory, because he did believe that sitting next to Jackson elevated his legitimacy in mainstream society, which is a risk that I think one must be willing to take if one is in the public arena fighting for worthy causes such as civil rights. When you allow opponents of your position to go unchallenged, then you allow their cohort, their flock, to feel as if they have the moral high ground. And what Jackson did was he exposed Duke as not having the moral high ground. And I'm not sure one can persuade the followers of a Klansman, but he also showed that, by Duke's own admission, a black person, a black civil rights leader, is not easy to caricature and dismiss. And that's part of the opportunity that Vice President Harris missed. By going on Rogan's show, at a minimum, she could have shown that a liberal feminist woman in the Democratic Party is not easy to mock and transform into a cartoon.
Although, to be fair to Joe Rogan, I mean, he's not David Duke.
No, of course not. And that's one reason why I wrote this essay, is to say, if Jesse Jackson was willing to sit down with David Duke, someone who is far more odious and far more destructive than Joe Rogan, then certainly Kamala Harris should have been willing to sit down with Joe Rogan, and her young progressive staffers and those who are like-minded should have understood that, and should understand that argument and confrontation is vastly superior as an intellectual and political form of engagement than blackballing.
So, David, what's changed in political culture over the last 50 years? Almost 50 years since the Jackson Duke engagement. I wouldn't necessarily call it a debate. James Carville, who doesn't mince his words, was horrified by the decision of Harris not to appear. He said, and I'm quoting him here, "Campaigns are authoritarian by nature. If I was running a 2028 campaign and had some little snot-nosed 23-year-old saying, 'I'm going to resign if you don't do this,' not only would I fire that motherfucker on the spot, I would find out who hired him and fire that person on the spot too." And then he said, "Let me tell you exactly what you tell these people, what I would tell them. Not only am I not interested in your fucking opinion, I'm not even going to call you by your name. You're 23 years old. I really don't give a shit what you think." Is Carville right? I mean, he puts it in rather vulgar terms.
I do think that Carville's right. There's, within the Democratic Party, and I'm a Democratic voter, a very loyal one, but within the Democratic Party and within progressive media, there is a certain cult of youth that has emerged within the past maybe 10 years, in which people are always chasing these trends and trying to appear relevant, and there's an adoption of certain nomenclature and vocabulary terminology. And that's something that should be flipped. I think Carville is onto something there, but there's an interesting contradiction, because as Democratic leaders and progressive media somewhat kowtow to youth, the party remains a gerontocracy. So it's as if they've adopted the worst of both worlds. They're allowing senior citizens to represent them in the public eye, while giving unearned credence to the opinions of 23-year-olds and 25-year-olds whose level of historical knowledge and political sophistication are probably quite dubious.
So I want to come back to the Jackson Duke conversation, the television conversation, in a second. But what's the argument against, or what was the argument against Harris appearing on Rogan? Was it that Rogan is immoral and that she shouldn't be in any way associated? Was it that it wouldn't do her campaign any good? Are these staffers so moralistic that they can't imagine any kind of interaction with people that they don't agree with?
It's a bit of both. So there are people who said Rogan is immoral. To sit down with him legitimizes him, it platforms him. And then there are others.
What does that mean, platform, David?
Well, I used that wrongly. Rogan has his own platform, of course, but it legitimizes him. Just to stay with that one, it as the vice president, as a candidate for the presidency, if you sit down with this chauvinistic comedian, transphobe, conspiracy theorist, you elevate him to your level. That was one position. So that's the backlash. How dare you sit down with him? You've insulted all of the people that support you and find Rogan offensive. And then there were others who said, well, anyone watching Rogan isn't going to vote Democratic anyway. So why give him the time of the day? Why waste your time on a program where 90-something% of the viewers are already Republican?
Yeah, I mean, this phrase, how dare you, it's so hardcore Puritan. I mean, is this in some ways a return on the left to the intolerant Puritanism of the founding fathers? This sort of witch hunt like language. How dare you? What does that even mean? I hear this phrase all the time. How dare you? But what does it mean?
There's a juvenile mentality that posits sitting down with someone who has expressed offensive views somehow sanctions those views. So in the essay that I wrote, I compare it to cooties. Joe Rogan has cooties, and therefore sitting down with him will give you cooties as well. When in the end, the actual result is the appearance of weakness and the appearance of an unwillingness to confront the adversary and put one's views under the fire. And that's one thing. Even if over 90% of Rogan's viewers would have voted Republican anyway, which is something I don't know is a fact, but let's concede that that's the case. Sitting down with Rogan and having a good moment, confronting him on some of his nonsense would have, if nothing else, fired up Kamala Harris's base of voters. And I should say, so it's not all criticism of the current vice president, her best moment in the campaign was her debate with Donald Trump. Even by the admission of Trump supporters, she won that debate handily and decisively. So given that she has that prosecutorial skill and that she already distinguished herself in a debate setting, why not put it to good use with Joe Rogan, who's somewhat of a hero to these chauvinistic bros, as they're called, and to people with a certain blockhead mindset that is resistant toward feminism?
One of the reasons, apparently, that she considered at least going on Rogan, and I'm quoting a Reuters piece, was that she was in the hunt. I don't think it was a particularly successful hunt for male votes. As again, there's a rather sort of patronizing. Maybe this is the way that the Reuters piece put it, but isn't this all rather patronizing? The idea that she might have to dirty herself to get male votes by going on Joe Rogan. The whole enterprise just leaves one depressed and aggravated. What does that mean? Find male votes.
It's interesting that we're having this conversation in the immediate aftermath of Jimmy Carter's death. Carter was admirable for a variety of reasons, but as his own diaries reveal, he saw himself often above the political process in Washington, D.C. He often refused to get his hands dirty, work with Congress, advocate for his positions. As he told one staffer, excuse my language, but I'm quoting him verbatim, "You have no idea how fucked up this place is," which is why he focused increasingly on foreign policy as his term developed.
Yeah, I mean, he was a great man, but not a great certainly anything but a great president.
Certainly a great man.
His life
yes.
after the presidency was very distinguished,
but this goes directly to the point, because this was the main reason Ted Kennedy challenged him as a primary opponent in the 1979 Democratic primary, 1980. Because Ted Kennedy felt, if you feel that way about the political process, that it's too dirty, maybe you have a correct moral argument, maybe your cultural observation is accurate, but then don't occupy the White House, don't run for president, do something else. So if you feel this way about the voters, that you have to question whether or not you should sit down in the venues where the voters observe your behavior, then maybe you're not fit for the enterprise. And, Jesse Jackson, one of the things I learned about him during the 6 years I spent interviewing him, during the other research I conducted for my book, is he never shirked a fight. He jumped at every opportunity to advocate for civil rights, social justice, more shared prosperity, a more peaceful foreign policy posture. And that courage of his convictions, that confidence, is one of the reasons why he was so successful in affecting change and compiling accomplishments, not only nationally, but globally.
Yeah, I don't want to, people are not going to like this comparison, but can one compare Trump with Jackson? They're very different kinds of characters, very different kinds of political ideas. But whatever one thinks about Trump, he sat down with the National Association of Black Journalists. He said some of the more absurd things, I think, in the campaign about Kamala not really being black and this whole remark about being Indian and all the rest of it. But is there something oddly old-fashioned about Trump's ability to sit down with anyone he feels comfortable talking to, and it doesn't matter whether they agree with him or not?
I'm not sure that I would say I won't qualify it that way. I don't think that your comparison is accurate, because Donald Trump, yes, he did have that appearance at the National Association of Black Journalists convention, and it went rather poorly for him, although of course he won the election. So
yeah, I mean, all these things go poorly, and he wins the election. The debate went poorly. That went poorly. He said,
but I would say
a lot of ludicrous stuff, but it didn't seem to make any have any impact on the election itself.
But we have to be fair. Kamala Harris did sit down and give an interview on Fox News. Trump refused to go on to MSNBC. Trump, at least in the 2024 election, it didn't give hardly any interviews to unfriendly outlets. He did in 2016, of course, and he did in 2020. But in 2024, he did not. Trump's bubble was just as tight as some would accuse Harris's bubble of being. But I would actually say that Harris probably gave more interviews to unfriendly outlets than Trump did. We can't say that, however, about J.D. Vance.
Vance was on everything. Right. So let's just, because not everyone's going to be familiar with this debate between Jackson and Duke. Firstly, was it really a debate? I mean, Jackson had his own show, so he's essentially inviting Duke onto the show. Is that fair in 77?
No, that's actually not correct. So Jackson had two conversations with Duke. The first in 1977 was on another program on which they were both guests.
Okay.
The second conversation took place on Jackson's show in the early 1990s.
And you're writing about the 77 debate?
Yes.
So tell us about, I know there was some really, from your piece, some really interesting, I don't know if this is the right word, conversations or debates. What were the high points? And I guess the low points too.
The low points are easy. I mean, Duke compared Black people to animals. He compared Black neighborhoods to jungles, implied and also stated overtly that Black people have inferior intelligence, have contributed nothing to the United States of America. The high points were Jackson's steady dismantlement of this position, but Jackson did so in such a way that was stoic. It was almost laconic, the way that he meticulously broke down the historical idiocy, political destructiveness, and moral ineptitude of Duke's racism. Jackson never once played the "I'm offended" card, although he certainly could have, and I'm sure he was.
He never said, "How dare you," I'm sure.
Right, yeah, never said anything like that, but instead offered a case of logic and reason and learnedness, to often argue that Duke was in fact an embarrassment, to use Jackson's term, to the best of white thought, the highest of white thought. And there is a great moment where Jackson's use of humor earns him applause and laughter from the audience, and even provokes laughter from a rather embarrassed Duke. Jackson talks about the contribution that the slaves made to the United States, making cotton king and helping to build the Southern economy, which of course had national effects. And Duke says, well, the horse contributed more. If you're just going to talk about physical labor, the horse contributed more to the United States than any Black people. And Jackson says something to the effect of, well, if that's the standard we're going to use, then the horse would have the most authority in our country. Black people would be second, and those like you would be on the streets fighting for the rights of a horse. So yeah, these are, that's the kind of moment that shows how the use of logic, reason, information.
Yeah, I can't imagine, David, this conversation taking place in the 2020s with
exactly.
anyone on the, and I use this term carefully, far right. I think that's overused, that term, but certainly people who talk about black people being inferior to whites and all the rest of it. I mean, that's far right. That's neo-Nazi ideology. If you had someone like that and someone from a mainstream figure from within the African-American community, it's impossible to imagine this kind of conversation taking place in the 2020s, isn't it?
It certainly is. And it's even impossible to imagine the debate that took place between James Baldwin and William F. Buckley.
Yeah, that's another one. The Baldwin Buckley conversation.
Right. And now Buckley, of course.
What year was that?
I can't remember the exact year. It was in the early 60s, because it was before the passage of the first Civil Rights Act. But Buckley, of course, wasn't as dangerous and nauseating as Duke, but Buckley was an opponent of the civil rights movement. So therefore, he was in favor, at least at the time, of the Jim Crow laws and forced segregation, denial of public accommodations to blacks and others, as it were, who were affected by those laws. And Baldwin, similar to Jackson, showed no hesitation in debating Buckley, and Buckley, similar to Duke, would concede that he lost the debate. And that debate is more famous than the Jackson-Duke debate. It's actually the premise of a play running in Chicago as we speak, and it's celebrated as a triumph of intellectual brilliance on the part of Baldwin, but also advocacy for racial equality and civil rights. But to your point, it's very difficult, almost impossible to imagine a Jackson-Duke or even a Baldwin-Buckley debate taking place in the 2020s, because, first of all, both sides often retreat to their corners, their silos, and they take some odd, perverse comfort in this idea of moral purity. We won't deign to talk to someone who feels differently than us, and our democracy suffers as a result. Our culture suffers as a result. And if you're a believer in progressive politics, as I am, a progressive future for the United States appears less likely as a result.
So David, and I'm ambivalent, I don't know the answer to this. Are there any conditions where a Jackson, a Baldwin should refuse to debate? I mean, Duke was pretty explicit in his biological racism. He believed that black people were inferior in every sense to white people. Are there situations where a Jackson should have said, no, I'm just refusing to deal with this person? They're unacceptable.
That's a very good question, because it's very difficult to know where to draw that line. Yes, of course, there should be people who are exiled from the public sphere, as it were, people who are deemed beneath contempt and therefore not worthy of one's time and effort. But in some cases, I would say that it's not up to you, it's up to the audience. So David Duke, whether one liked or loathed him, and one would hope that anyone civilized would loathe him, in 1977 and in 1991, which I believe was the second time Jackson sat down with him, had an audience. He had followers, he had supporters. And Jackson said in 77, during their initial debate, he said, the reason that I agreed to do this is because as white people begin to experience some of the economic hardships that Black and Latino people have known for a long time, many of them will become increasingly susceptible to forms of political and racial demagoguery. So Jackson wanted to present a case to Duke's audience. Jackson wasn't as interested in Duke, but in Duke's audience.
And that's an important point, because as I said, John Gantz's book, which has been very well received, a very good book, When the Clock Broke, Con Men, Conspiracists, and How America Cracked Up in the Early 1990s. This cracking up was the mainstreaming, again, to use a rather ugly term, of men like David Duke, who increasingly became acceptable within the Republican Party. Maybe not quite Duke, but certainly those ideas. And of course, in the quarter century since then, we've had the rise of Trump and the mainstreaming of right-wing populism within the Republican Party.
Right. One thing that you find with the history of the Republican Party, and of course there's exceptions to this, there are people within the Republican Party who are quite admirable, but they're never that far removed from white supremacy, sexism. They occupy.
Well, but David, white supremacy and sexism are quite different.
Yes, they are quite different. What I'm saying is,
categories,
whether it's Nixon's Southern strategy or Reagan's demagoguery surrounding welfare queens, or Pat Buchanan speaking at the Republican convention, the Republican Party has always played games with these people and winked and nodded to them. To your first point. Which makes confronting them all the more important. And
I wonder if this goes the other way. Luigi Mangioni's assassination of a senior healthcare executive has, as you know, has elicited a great deal of not just controversy, but some sympathy on the left. I don't know if it's the left, certainly amongst people who believe that we have the right to violence. We've touched on this on a number of conversations on the show. Should, for example, people sympathetic to Mangione be debated by more mainstream, shall we say, liberals who believe that, who will argue that there's never any right to violence, whether or not you agree with your opponent? Can we reverse this? Do we always have to think of it as the equivalent of David Duke on the right? Isn't there an equivalent on the left?
Yes, certainly. And the fact that these debates are becoming all the more important indicates a certain level of political and cultural decline. If you're debating, is the cold-blooded murder of a health insurance industry executive justifiable, you're indicating that your society has undergone some moral degradation in the first place. But I would say the celebration of Mangione, and I say this as someone who believes that our healthcare system is in desperate need of reform, and that the health insurance industry commits myriad injustices. But the celebration of Mangione offers a dark, logical endpoint of politics once debate is itself demonized. If you see debate as unworthy of you, and if you see sitting down with someone who has a different viewpoint as indicative of some kind of disease, then you're getting awfully close to feeling that, well, if someone's not worthy of my time and energy in debate, maybe that person isn't worthy to have any position, or maybe that person isn't worthy to even exist. We're moving past the democratic politics of argument, engagement, and persuasion, and moving into a politics of rage, hatred, bitterness, and violence. And the celebration of Mangione shows how that has taken root on the left as well as the right.
I mean, on the left, you could argue, some people would certainly argue, that when it comes to something like Gaza, for example, the American political establishment from left to right is unwilling and incapable of addressing the mass murder, as they would put it, of tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians. So it's the culture that's rotten. When America, perhaps in some ways, goes back to Vietnam, when America is backing an illegitimate regime that's now considered terroristic by the United Nations, we can't necessarily blame young people or people on the right or the left. Isn't there a bigger problem here of an unwillingness, a cultural unwillingness to address the dirty secrets that we're all uncomfortable with but not willing to discuss? I don't remember the last time there was even a serious debate on Israel-Palestine on American television. Both sides would refuse to talk to the other. And of course, on campuses, university presidents are increasingly clamping down on demonstrators.
Yes.
So there's a sort of a broader, perhaps, intolerance, which is very, very troubling. We can't just blame it on people who work for or people who work for Kamala Harris.
Of course not. Of course not. It's something that is bipartisan, and it's something that has encroached upon all of the institutions of our society. You raised some very good examples. On the other side of the Israel-Palestine debate, you have writers calling for a boycott of Israeli publishing companies.
It's always the boycotting, whether it on one side or the other.
Right.
And particularly writers. And it's always particularly troubling when writers are calling on the boycotting of other writers.
Right. And there were trade magazines that refused to advertise Bernard Henry Levy's book, Israel Alone. So there's a real, I hate the phrase both sides because it sounds so wishy-washy. But with the Israel-Palestine debate, there's an instinct towards censorship and repression on both sides. But to your question about the secrets, I would say, and the darkness of our society and unwillingness to confront it, I would say what's darker and more evil and destructive than the state-sanctioned terrorism and racism of Jim Crow and Jesse Jackson and his mentor and at one point boss, Martin Luther King Jr., along with Andrew Young and Fannie Lou Hamer and all the heroes of the civil rights movement, they confronted that darkness and that evil and that terror through democratic means, and they succeeded.
As adults, as they took the high, I wouldn't say they took the high moral ground. They took the high, or Jackson took the high intellectual ground.
Yes, and they also took the civil rights movement as a whole took the high moral ground as a method of strategy, but also evidence of belief in a well-defined moral philosophy of civil disobedience and nonviolent protest and resistance. And their success should teach us, as we are up against far less severe circumstances, that democratic engagement, the democratic sensibility is vastly superior politically, morally, and intellectually than shunning the adversary, than censorship, than repression, than blackballing.
Yeah, and I think we've got to end in a second, David, but it seems as if we've got two things going on at the same time. On the one hand, we have our echo chamber culture dominated by social media, where people are more and more angry and angrier, more and more outrageous, talking to themselves or talking to their own community, more and more intolerant of the other side. But we're missing a public space where a Jackson can sit down with a Duke. So that only compounds the other world. And I don't know how to bring them together.
Yes. And another person we could discuss is I wrote a column for Salon paying tribute to Phil Donahue after his death. And of course, Donahue did thousands and thousands of shows, so some of them were a little goofy. But Donahue's best work was sitting down and having intelligent conversation with Ayn Rand, Milton Friedman, to members of the American Communist Party. Donahue sat down with Louis Farrakhan. He sat down with David Duke. He interviewed Jesse Jackson. So there was this spirit of conversation and curiosity that not only Donahue, of course, but many people understood was part of the lifeblood of a democratic society. And as that spirit has been exorcised and is no longer present, we certainly must worry about the future of our democracy, because a democratic system of governance depends upon a culture that prizes and promotes the values of democratic values.
Yeah, well said, David. I think you're definitely onto something in reminding ourselves of this Jackson Duke debate. Whether it's a debate or a conversation, I'm not sure, but it's an important piece. Congratulations on it. And we will talk again, no doubt, in the year about how to revive and strengthen American democracy. This is the heart of the issue, I think, that we're discussing. And you've done a very, very good job reminding us of the role of Jesse Jackson in underlining the power of intellectual ideas and expressing oneself in a responsible, coherent way. So thank you so much, David Masciotra.
Thank you.
I'm ready to attack. Andrew Keene, yeah, he's the one to bash. Asking questions, no filter, just keeps on grinning. He's the man who's got the whole crowd spinning. Money, fame, success, it's all in his sight. He'll dig deep, expose you with all his might. No sugarcoating, he'll cut right through. Andrew Keene, he's the one to spew. Yeah, he's an expert.